There we go. Here we go. All right. Dr. Andrew Hart. And that's probably the only time I'm going to say Andrew because I think you usually go by Drew, correct?
Yeah, I go by Drew. Yeah.
Perfect. Well, the email says Andrew, so I just wanted to be accurate. But welcome to the show. Very excited to have you here. Your work I have read off and on for many, many years. Yeah, so I'm very excited to talk with you, but thanks for coming on today.
Yeah, I'm glad to be on the show with you and to discourse about things that are very relevant for our moment today.
Yeah, and how sad is that that's still a conversation that's so relevant? But
Yeah,
we'll get there.
I often do tell folks that I look forward to the day where my books are obsolete and no longer meaningful, right? Yeah.
Yeah, how great would that be? Yeah, and that's the case for a lot of topics, especially religious and politically based. So for those that are listening that are like, I don't know who Drew is, like, yay, he's on the show. What are the things that kind of make you you? If you were to like high level out and you're like, yeah, here's why, here's kind of what shaped me into whatever you are right now.
Yeah, it's hard to give the elevator speech of that, but I would guess some of what I would say first, they can think of me as a Pennsylvanian boy. I bounced back and forth between Philly to Harrisburg to Philly to Harrisburg. And so that's, I guess, been a significant part of my life. I am the son of Tony and Carol, right? My parents, and I have siblings, a year older, 2 years older, 9 years younger. I've lived in mostly Black communities most of my life, except for, and I talk about it in Trouble I've Seen, 3 years in high school and then 4 years for college. And so my communities that I've been a part of have deeply shaped me. I currently am an assistant professor of theology, teaching I just finished my 4th year of teaching at Messiah University. Now we're fancy now. We're not a college anymore. We're, big time. And yeah, I'm deeply involved aside from the teaching that I do, I am deeply involved in a lot of other work, anti-racism work with churches and other organizations. I collaborate with organizers and activists in my city. And in fact, I'm a co-leader for a group in Harrisburg that partners with organizers and activists and connects them with the church. And so anyway, just a whole variety of stuff that make me, I guess.
Yeah, no. So my wife's college was Lynchburg College, and then recently became Lynchburg University. And I went to Liberty University. So now there's 2 LUs in the same city there. And she got really upset when they made it Lynchburg University.
Right.
Is there that same animosity there at Messiah? Because honestly, I've always called it Messiah College. I didn't even know it was Messiah University.
It just changed. It literally just changed July 1st.
Okay.
So this is new. So most people don't know unless
Was it a big thing though, where people are like, no, it's Messiah College. Like this is what it is.
So here's the funny thing. As an alum, so when I was a student, there was this rumor that they were going to change the name of the school from Messiah College to Grantham University. And people got extremely offended. You're taking Messiah out the name, how profane and all this stuff. Anyway, so I think it was just teasing ideas, but people went. So I think that it's still Messiah University. I think most people probably don't care that much. I don't know. I don't think anybody cares that much.
My wife did. Yeah, she has refused to buy any merchandise that says alumni on it. Like I have a couple of shirts that she gave me that say Lynchburg College, and she's got like a blanket, and she's like, nobody sleeps in this blanket because I can't get another one. Like, these have become artifacts, and don't touch my things. Don't break my things.
That's right.
I don't have that affinity towards my alma mater. For many reasons, which we can talk about at a different time. So I wanted to bring you on today. You are extensive, and you just referenced it as well. You do a lot of work in anti-racism work, the church, theology. So what do you teach at Messiah University? Like, are you teaching that, or are you just teaching like general level courses? And then kind of what, if you are teaching that, like anti-racism type stuff, or the history of race in the church, what's the feedback from the students? Because I think most people come to school and they're like, oh, nobody told me that.
Yeah, I teach a range of courses at Messiah College. In fact, it's been kind of neat because I feel like I get to express a lot of the different parts of me in different ways. So every fall I teach a course that's not a part of my department teaching. It's called, it's a first year seminar course, and it's called The Politics of Blackness. It's Black
Mm.
history and intellectual thoughts, a little theology. And yeah, so I teach that with first year students. We read, you know, historical texts, Black intellectuals, all kinds of stuff. And actually I've had really good experiences with students in that class. I always tweak it a little bit just for my own sake. I mean,
Yeah.
it's a course where I get to read what I want to read with students, right? And so there's some common text that we keep going and other ones that we keep shifting. But yeah, I've had really good experiences with that. I teach every fall African-American theology.
Mm.
That's deeply important for me to be able to teach that course. And I've had, I mean, students just rave about that course. And so those two probably are my most popular courses that I
Mm.
teach. But I teach I teach an Anabaptist theology class. I teach a faith and society. All these are gen ed theology options that students can take who are outside of the major. But I teach upper level theology 2, theology 3, some more standard themes. I still always incorporate some stuff on race
Yeah.
in all of that. Black theologians, womanist theologians, different voices, mixing it up. I also teach a course every 2 years called Mobilizing Congregations for Justice. It's a part of the Christian Ministries part of our department. So because I have pastoral ministry experience, they kind of thought that I could bring some neat stuff to the table. And so, yeah, that's been really cool. I've only taught that twice so far in my 4 years, but it's a really cool course. And it gets me to be able to kind of tease and expose my students to movement work, organizing work, social
Yeah.
change, right? And how that relates to the gospel. And so, yeah,
Yeah.
it's been a lot of
So
fun.
when you're teaching these courses, specifically the ones that are about, you know, church history and some of that stuff, like I would assume most students coming, there's an ignorance level there, because
Oh,
honestly, there's an
absolutely.
ignorance level on me. So what's kind of that feedback where people are like, that's not what I was told. Like my pastor's never told me that. That's not
Right.
in my McGraw-Hill history book. Like
Right.
like, what's that feedback kind of, because the reason I ask is I often ask people about like the youthful generation, like so that in 50 years your books are obsolete and my
Right.
daughter doesn't have to worry about patriarchy and, you know, that type of stuff.
Right.
Um, but I meet so few people that actually are talking with the people that will
Right.
be those
Right.
people, and those
That's
are
right.
all bad sentences. So I'm
Yeah.
curious,
Yeah.
kind of the feedback that you get from the students there.
So most students come in, especially when I'm teaching for first year seminar course. I mean, these are brand new, straight to the campus, haven't even been a part of the campus conversation. So
Mhm.
they absolutely have no clue what they're getting themselves into. I intentionally kind of just ease them in with history first, just because that's just the most helpful. So we start usually from slavery and just kind of move up towards the present. And most times I spend the most time on 20th century history, because that's actually, I think, the biggest gap for folks is actually 20th century history. They have this perception that, you know, the 20th century was just about Black people sitting at the back of the bus and not and separate water fountains, right? And that was the heart of what the problem was.
Well, to be
Um,
fair, that's what the one chapter in the history book says it is.
right.
Yeah.
And so they know nothing about convict leasing system, all the neo-slavery convict leasing systems, peonage, chain gangs, sharecropping, all
Hmm.
the ways that Black people's labor is being exploited. They don't know, some of them never even heard of lynching. I'm still surprised every year that
Mm.
there's a portion of students that don't even know what lynching is, and that
Oh
that
man.
it was a means of racial terrorism and control over Black people, the ways that we completely just contorted and controlled geography by race and people's belonging and where they can belong and not belong. And I mean, there's so much more I could get into. The
Yeah.
policies that white people benefited from like progressive era laws that Black people were excluded from, that helped to grow the white middle class. Like all these things, they just no awareness of it. And so it shapes how people come into the conversation. So if I just ease them in and we just kind of walk through decade by decade, really, most students are prepared to say like slavery is a terrible thing. And so you start where they're already in agreement, and
Yeah.
there's just kind of like a frog boiling in the hot, you're just turning up the heat, right? And they just kind of go with you because it just kind of unfolds organically when you're actually looking, giving a close reading to what was actually happening in the history. So for me, I've gotten very little pushback in that kind of work because we're just kind of moving through history first before we engage in kind of the intellectual thought and stuff that makes much more sense once you actually know the history. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. I know, well, when I went to college, I also still didn't learn any of that. It wasn't until afterwards.
Yeah.
Actually,
Yeah.
part and parcel, I started doing this podcast and some publishers sent me a few books. And I was like, one of them was Rethinking Incarceration.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
Dominic, yeah.
Dominic Gilley.
And
That's
I
a
just got
friend.
so angry. And I talked to I have some good friends that are Black and my good friend Josh, he's like, yeah, like, why aren't you paying attention? What's wrong with you?
Yeah.
And it's turned into some beautiful conversations since, and some hard conversations. So I want to roll it back towards the church, especially, I guess, in that 19th century, since that so much of that impacts where we live in right now, and maybe even you can go back before that. What's kind of the church's and so to set some context, we got George Floyd, we got Ahmaud Arbery, we got Breonna, we got all every 3 weeks somebody else is murdered, and I'm aware that that is a charged word, and I use it intentionally. And the church has complicity in that, at least from, that's what I think. But I find often I don't know how to adequately articulate that. And it was actually with a recent interview. I talked with Justin Douglas, and he's like, "Dude, you should really talk with Drew Hart." And I was like, "Okay, let's do it." Because we talked about it in brief, but not a lot. And so, what is kind of some of the history of the church as it relates to, I guess, racism in America, power struggles in America, et cetera, for you and I today? Like, where did all this kind of fester up?
Well, I think the very first thing that we've got to recognize is that the church is like literally birthed racism, like modern racism as we understand it today. So by that I mean, like, if you go back to the 15th century, in fact, you go back further, right? So you have like this history of Western Christendom that's growing and growing and arriving. It's basically like Christian supremacy over society, right? Over Western civilization. And during that time, like when you get to like the Crusades and stuff, you have some papal bulls that actually are justifying the plundering of lands as early as the Crusades. This idea of terra nullius, empty lands, right? If it's not Christian land, it's empty land, right? Now you jump forward to the 15th century, and you have Portugal and Spain getting permission from the church through another papal bull to not only plunder and steal, but to enslave and like everything. Like it's just, and so like that's where modern like colonial slavery, conquest, all that stuff starts with Portugal and Spain in the 15th century. And the church is giving theological, doctrinal permission, right, to go do that work.
Mm.
And so that's the contrast. It's important that we see that Christian supremacy in society birthed white supremacy in society. Like it literally mutated into that. In fact, as the word white begins to emerge over time, it actually is a synonymous term with Christian. Like that's what people mean when they say white,
Oh,
they mean Christian, because they've
really?
conflated Western society and Western Europe with Christianity so much they forget that they are Gentiles and that they've been engrafted into somebody else's story, and now they think they have a copyright over it, and that if anybody wants to become Christian, you come through us, right?
Mm.
We have a copyright on Christianity, on the Bible, on interpreting the Bible, and on Jesus himself, right? And so yeah, white supremacy is a theological problem first before we can even call it a sociological problem. We birth the problem. And so there's a difference between like broader ethnocentrism or tribalism and different power dynamics, in-group, out-group, things that have always existed. But modern racism as we know it today grew out of so-called Christian societies that created hierarchies, right? Now you could argue that some of the work was first that colonial Christian language, then there was within those societies, pseudo-scientific arguments that are being made, but they're being made in within still the logics of Christianity, a diseased Christianity, as Jennings would say, but nonetheless a Christianity, and nonetheless. And so these are distorted theologies that reorder creation, right? Literally, where Europeans are deemed superior in beauty, worth, and value, and intellect and morality. The African is at the bottom of that hierarchy, and other people are kind of scattered. And so, yeah, I think that if we're going to talk about racism today in our context, the first thing we have to do is stop pushing the idea that somehow, oh, our society is so bad and so racist, as if we just got drug into the problem rather than the church created the problem. And so, yeah, that would be one of the things. But then along the way, I mean, at every stage, there's complicity involved in white supremacy in our society at every stage. There's no, in fact, so I think in my Trouble I've Seen, I quote, was it in the night, I think it was 1946. So if you think like the 40s and 50s are actually the peak of what people would call a Christianized America. The highest percentage of Americans consider themselves Christians in like the 40s, 50s period,
Really?
time period. Yeah. Which is, there's this false perception that there's been this like decaying of Christianity for a very long time. But it's actually the opposite, is that from the colonial moment up until the mid 20th century, there's an increasing and a Christianizing of American society that doesn't stop until the mid 20th century. Anyway, so in that peak, you have all of a sudden, you know, obviously there's Jim Crow and all the stuff that are happening and unfolding in that space. And 7 out of 10 white people in that moment, in the highest percentage of Christianized America, at least whatever that means, right? 7 out of 10 believe that Negroes are being treated fairly in this country, right? In the 40s, right? We know all the horrible, the lynching, the segregation, the Jim Crow, the KKK stuff. You know, the exclusion from participation in voting rights and all of that, right? We've seen the black and white documentaries of just a decade or two later of Black people getting beat over their heads. We just talking about John Lewis's legacy and all that folks like him stood for and fought for. And so it's baffling to see that our supposedly most Christianized moment is just complete denial of the racism that was just so blatant and literally organized in very obvious ways our entire society, right? And most Christians were quiet and complicit to that. And so I think that's just one way of getting into the conversation, is just seeing either the perpetuation of the systems of racism or the silence to them, and certainly benefiting from those systems.
Yeah, one of the questions I wrote down, actually, it's a broken sentence, so it's one that I haven't figured out how to voice yet. So I'm going to try to voice it now.
Yeah.
So often, and it's 2 different questions, and we can tackle them at different times. So I have found people like myself, and I'm probably sure also myself, you know, when I cross that traverse isn't the right way, that chasm of I didn't see it before, I see it now.
Yeah.
I can't quite put my finger on what I was afraid to lose by engaging in a conversation about race in the church in America. Like, because I haven't lost anything. Like, I've lost a few friends, but we could argue they probably weren't friends to begin with, or maybe ones that I probably not should have been friends with, or at least, you know, engaging in deep, meaningful conversations with outside of a tertiary level. But I think so often most people, especially in the church, the white Christian American church, are like, no, I think they're quiet because they're afraid they're going to lose something. Like I'm going to give up something. But then when I look back, I can't find that I've lost anything. I probably gained way, way, way more than I ever thought I might lose. But I don't remember having that mental thought until afterwards. And so I'm curious, with your experience, because you travel the country, you talk on this a lot. I'm sure you talk in churches, universities, and et cetera. Your thoughts on that? Like, what do you feel like the church feels like it's going to lose by staying quiet? Because silence is complicity. If you don't say anything, then you're complicit. Like, you're an accessory to whatever happened.
Yeah. So I would say, so probably what I would say is there are concrete things that will be lost, and there's concrete things that will be won, right, for white people. Because there is a system in place that was set up and designed for white people, to advantage white people. So I'll talk like here in Pennsylvania, there's been an ongoing struggle around just the funding for public education by the state. So like you have two sources, right? You have the tax base that funds it, but there's about 35 to 40% of the funding that comes from the state. And in Pennsylvania, for a very long time, we didn't have a fair funding formula. And so people looked at, which most states do.
What do you mean fair funding? Like, what does that mean?
In terms of a formula that decides how that money should be distributed. So it's not being allocated.
So like
unjustly.
If it's 10 schools, they all get 10% or whatever.
Or just whatever method, right? There could be a whole variety of complex, things that they're using, but that there's a methodology that makes sure that it's not discriminatory, right?
Right.
Anyway, so for a very long time, we didn't have a fair funding formula. Most states do. There are a couple others I think that still don't, but most do. There was enough pushing because they did work and showed that in Pennsylvania, the whiter a school district was, the more likely that they were going to be overfunded by the states, and the more people of color in a school district, the more likely that they're going to be underfunded by the states, right? And what surprised me, like in learning all this, which it shouldn't, you'd think someone like me would not be surprised anymore, but I was surprised that it wasn't based on class. I thought that was going to be a greater. So like when they did the research, they found that white rural communities, poorer communities, were also being overfunded by the state. Now they were still struggling in terms of like the tax base part of it, but from the state portion, they were being overfunded. And like schools like where like Kobe Bryant grew up, he grew up in this like middle class Black community outside of Philly, Lower Merion, and his community was being underfunded by the state. Now, again, I would say like they probably were okay because of the local tax base and in some ways could make up for it. Mm-hmm. But nonetheless, there was this discrepancy that was happening across the board that race was the greatest determinant for whether that was going to happen or not. Anyway, so they got our state to push to finally adopt a fair funding formula. But what they did was they increased the budget for the state by like, I think it was 6 or 8%, put the new money through the fair funding formula and left everything else out of it, right? Which I consider like an admission of guilt more than it is actually fixing anything. So, so now there's this push, right? But some of the challenges is that if this is a state issue, like it's going to take more than just Philadelphia and Harrisburg and Pittsburgh and some of these largely minority dominant, cities to get on board. We're going to need white communities, at least some, to get on board and say, this is wrong. And we're going to vote in a way that's actually going to give us less resources, right? And so there's an advantage in the system that's built in for many places. Maybe not everyone has this exact problem, but it's these kinds of problems that exist where there's baked in advantages for communities that have already been advantaged, that it just perpetuates itself. And so how do we create and stop that from happening? So I think those kind of things, but on the other hand, I do think like it's actually a way better, like to be fully human and to connect with people and the relationships and the richness of intercultural interactions and all. I mean, it's just actually really beautiful, right? And so I think that when you think about, especially as Christians, when we're talking about like God's reign on earth, the flourishing of people, shalom, that's what we're actually being invited into. And so like, that's the good news. And so, but some people will always hear the good news as bad news. That will always be the case, right? Yeah. The rich young man who doesn't want to walk away, sell all his things so he could, participate in God's kingdom, which would give him a different kind of abundance, right? But he couldn't see that. And so I think that is, so I always love when I hear white people see this as gain, because I'm like, there is something to be gained here, but it's depending on your own value system of what you actually think is worthwhile in society.
When I say like I didn't lose much, like financially it hasn't really impacted me.
Impacted you.
Which I'm aware that is, there's a lot of inequality in the job that I have and that type of stuff as well. Doesn't mean I haven't worked hard, but that doesn't mean that I didn't start on the second lap of the mile and then we both ran a mile. People can argue with me on that all they want, but that's not what we're here to do today. But But like when I think about like a better education system, like I think here in Virginia, like the dollars are apportioned by property values. And so the
Right.
property
Property
values are
value.
apportioned by the zip code. But being
Right.
that I'm in banking, I'm well aware because I take a training every 3 months that redlining still happens in different ways, and that it happened in overt ways not
Yeah.
that long ago, like in John Lewis's time and Martin Luther King's
That's
time,
right.
like, and those property values still suffer because of it, which means the schools in poorer neighborhoods
Suffer.
suffer because of it.
Absolutely. That's right.
So, but
Yeah.
most people get mad about that. I'm like, well, that's actually just math. Like, that's just
Right.
banking. Like,
It's
this
just
isn't a
math.
political, this isn't a
Right.
religious, this is not even a demographic thing. Like, this is just raw math. Like, we broke the values of the homes, and then we said schools get money based on the values of the homes.
And so
And
many
half the
people,
people that forgot, they
they're
died.
baffled. So many
Yeah,
people are baffled internationally when they're horrified that we would set up funding for education in this way, because it's obviously there's no way but for it to be an
yeah,
inequitable
yeah,
outcome, right? There's just
yeah,
it's designed to do that work.
yeah.
And for Black people, I mean, you got to remember, like a large percentage of Black people still do not even own their own homes. I think it's like a quarter, right, or something. I forget the exact
Yeah,
number, but it's a
yeah,
large percentage of. So you that's even less when you have all these renters, and certainly in
yeah.
Harrisburg, we have a very high renting population in our city. And so,
Mm.
how do you fund
Yeah.
education in those scenarios?
Yeah, and this is a sentence that I've become accustomed to using because people at the bank want to argue about politics, especially like the CARES Act and socialism and the president, and it's really hard because when I have a name tag on, I don't have an opinion. My
Yeah,
opinion is I voted for your person. I'm glad
yeah,
that they won. Like I'm
right,
glad they won. But realistically, what I've ended up telling people is, regardless of who's in power, what church is running the shots, what president's running the shots, what school board superintendent is running the shots, I live here. I have a vested interest in not only my kids knowing what's going on in 15 years because they're going to be fully functioning adults, but my neighbors' kids as well,
right,
regardless of race or gender. Like,
right,
I live here.
right,
I need educated people to continue to help society work. I live
right,
here.
right,
I need things to go well, and I need
right.
whoever the president is as well to go, because I live here. I have a vested interest, whether or not I agree with it, for it
And
to
that, I
work.
mean, it's a very biblical. When you think about like a theology of shalom, it forces us to recognize that we are interconnected, our interdependency with
Mhm.
one another, and seeking that kind of harmony, and that the well-being of everyone is dependent on each other, right? And
Yeah.
that to think of ourselves as such autonomous beings that have nothing to do with others, that's part of the reasons why we're in so many of the issues that we're in today, is because we don't see our interconnectedness, that somebody else's thriving and flourishing actually relates to mine, right?
Yeah.
And there's ways that I can do it in a harmful way that will perpetuate other problems, or we can link together and both rise up and we can all flourish together.
Yeah. Thinking of economies, just because now we're talking about banking, so I can't not think this, but I feel like I've heard you say it somewhere. And so I'm probably stealing it from you, but I'm actually not certain if I am. Maybe I made it up. I'm not smart enough to make it up. I'm sure I stole it from someone. But you brought up the rich man and that parable of, sell everything you have and come back. And he just couldn't do it. I feel like
Right.
so often churches in America um, are addicted to their endowment funds and all of the money that they hoard, and they usually don't give it away. I think as a church should, like they should just take it in and then, oh, you need something, whether or not you go to church here, I got you. You need food, I got you. You need a roof, I got you. Whatever you need to do. Um, versus Zacchaeus is like, oh, I did this. Oh, and now I've got to forgive everybody. Like I'm going to give all my money away because I've met Christ.
Yeah. Yeah.
I'm curious your thoughts on that. Do you feel like the church is in a position where they're acting more like the rich man or more like Zacchaeus? Or am I taking Zacchaeus the wrong way? Because I've always read it that way.
Yeah, I
Um,
mean, so to read Zacchaeus, you have to put it in context of the Gospel of Luke, right?
mhm,
Luke's Gospel has an unrelenting focus on economics. He just leans in heavy compared
mhm,
to the other Gospels. All of them, Jesus clearly in all the Gospels identifies with the poor
mhm,
and serves them in particular, and came up from a poor Galilean community himself, right? So it's not a question, but Luke's Gospel, it's just like a ongoing, unrelenting theme, and I mean, I've been saying to folks, it's funny because I don't know if you've been hearing some of it, but there's been some of this stuff about, oh, well, that's Marxism. I'm like, Marxism? Have you read like Luke
mhm,
or like the
mhm.
Gospel or the letter of James or something? Like these are vicious, right? Jesus has a vicious class consciousness in constantly critiquing the wealthy for hoarding, right? And for identifying the poor, not just the poor in spirit, but the poor themselves, as being a characteristic, a condition that is characteristic to the kingdom of God. And so it's really interesting, number one, just when you frame that out, the context of where the Zacchaeus story is coming out of. And you see this kind of theme of Jubilee, this Jubilee ethic, which reviving from like Leviticus, right? This idea where redistribution and reparation and returning lands and
Every 7
monies
years,
and fresh start, right? That happens, this kind of deliverance that unfolds. And so all of that is there. So then you have this Zacchaeus story that is literally side by side practically with the rich young ruler. And because they're right beside, they serve as kind of foils to one another. Here's this man who wants to follow Jesus, but he's not willing to take up Jesus's command to sell all he has and follow him and give it to the poor, right? That's actually what Jesus says, and give it to the poor. And of course, because people don't like hearing Jesus talk about that, they do all these fancy gymnastics for it to mean something
Which
else other than what it actually says, right?
Yeah.
Oh, it's just a matter of the heart. That's not what Jesus says, but that's what we say. It's just a matter of the heart. So this could be anything now. You just decide, and once your heart is in a good place, then you're fine. And then you don't actually have to do anything so long as you've adjusted your heart, right? You don't have to actually take the action that Jesus focused on. Anyway, so that's interesting. But the Zacchaeus story, you have this exploiter, tax collector, who's exploiting his own community, benefiting, a part of this system of exploitation. Jesus comes to town and he has this Jesus encounter with him, and his response is Jubilee ethics in two different ways. He says, I'll give half of my money to the poor. And then he says, I'll give 4 times back what I've taken from folks, right? So there's redistribution, which people hate, and there's reparations, which American Christians also hate, right? But that's the Jesus moment that he has. And that's in contrast to the rich young ruler's response, right? And it's not necessarily like, I think this plays out through the New Testament in a whole variety of different ways. So there's not like one singular way I think that this has to look. You think about like Paul and, number one, he says to Peter, the thing you got to remember, Peter says to Paul is remember the poor, right? That's in Galatians. So that's clear, part of the mission that you've got to remember the poor. But what we see with Paul then is, there's different regions and some people are struggling and other people are doing well. And so there's this kind of almost regional redistribution of wealth that's happening. And he's constantly kind of getting churches from different regions to see themselves as identified and taking care of wealth and inequalities in that kind of broader sense. We see in the Gospel of Acts, this radical communities that emerge. The Spirit takes roots and they share all things in common. And then they go out and they cause civil disobedience to get in trouble with the state. And then they come back and they intensify and do it even more. And people are selling their fields and giving it up and coming, it's just pretty radical. And this is in response to what we see happening in the Jesus story. I mean, Luke, right? It's the Luke Acts is the singular story being told. And so, anyway, we could go on and on. The radical critique of Revelation in terms of just the wealth of Babylon, right? That's Rome, and the kind of response that the church, right, exactly, America, in terms of how we live. And so, I think there's no question that the church, we've lost any kind of concrete, tangible way of actually following the Jesus ethic around money. We do some weird stuff where we make everything just about stewardship. And by stewardship, what people really mean is be wise with your money and make it work for you, right? That's a lot of times
stewardship
what we mean.
Is a synonym for hoarding. That's all.
Right. It's a synonym for hoarding, but in a Christian way, right? There's a Christian way to hoard and there's a non-Christian way to hoard. And so long as you're giving of your abundance, right? Which is actually one of the things Jesus critiques when he goes into the temple after he shuts it down, calls them a den of robbers for their exploitation. Then later, as he does his later teaching takeover in the temple, he points out, right? Look, he huddles them all together. He's like, watch this. And they see all the people giving all their wealth and they're just giving it's nothing to Jesus, right? And then he sees the widow give everything that she has. And what we miss, which is ironic that we miss, is previously Jesus actually says he critiques the temple for devouring widows' homes, right? Exploiting and taking everything from them, right? So I think like in that moment, what we miss is it's not just a praise, it's a praise and a lament. It's a praise that she has the characteristics of discipleship and that there's this system that would take everything from this widow, right?
Yeah.
And so we've
Yeah.
kind of missed the implications of how to deal with our money faithfully in radical ways that are participating in God's kingdom. And it's not a world in which we all then are poor. It's a world in where everyone has enough, right? Where everyone can flourish. And I think that we've lost sight of that. Yeah.
It's a critique. I've never actually thought about it that way, but it's a critique of the rich people giving out of their abundance of, if you had just done it correctly, like the way that you should have loved the people that are around you, you wouldn't be breaking the widow. She would still be giving what she can, obviously, because she already is, and everything would just be better. But yeah. So we talked a minute ago about myself. So here we go. So I feel like often white churches stay on the sidelines because they don't actually know how to take a stand. And so I think that's all the more important right now. And I know that, I've heard you talk a bit about the way, I lost the train of thought. What do you call it? The way that Martin Luther King would demonstrate. Peaceful protest? No. Is that what it's called?
Like nonviolence.
There it
action,
is. I couldn't think of the word. It escaped me. So for today, what should the role of the church be? Because what I don't want to see is all of this gasoline that has been poured into the engine of America to spin back out, and we have to have another social justice revolution. How do we continue and the church come alongside communities to take all of this brokenness with George Floyd and everything else for all the years prior as well, and actually affect some real change? Like, how does the church both exert influence and power and at the same time give it up, if that makes any sense?
Yeah. Some of it, we have to understand, like, who are we, right? Who are we as the church? What does it mean to be the church? What makes church? I mean, we can use the word, but not every gathering that happens in the world is a church, right? So what really makes us the church? And some of it, I mean, I would like to believe that the presence of Jesus needs to be present, and following the way of Jesus and participating in Christ together, and not just in the superficial abstract sense, but that we then have to be in unity with the way of Christ. Like if we're not in unity with the way of Christ, we're not being church in the called out ones, ecclesia, right? Mm-hmm. And so, yeah, I think that's the first thing, because the way of Jesus, it's clear, it's unambiguous, that Jesus was about prioritizing the least, the last, and lost of society. That's what Jesus did in his ministry. That's God's reign come on earth. He's prioritizing the Samaritans, the vulnerable women, the stigmatized, the sick, right, in society. And he's making them central in God's reign. And so the church, if we're in unity with Christ, is also living in congruity with that. And we're also in congruity then with the prophetic witness of Jesus. Again, we talked about him. He goes to Jerusalem. He clashes with the establishment. He speaks truthfully with integrity, a prophetic witness, right, in the public square about the injustices, because the temple at that time is the center for everything. It's not just the religious center. It's the cultural, political, economic, everything center for them, right? And they're in cahoots at this moment with Rome, right? I mean, that's just the history of that moment. And so Jesus goes in and he clashes, he confronts it. It's like an Occupy moment, right? Occupy the temple. He shuts it down, brings it to a standstill for a moment, which is hard. This is not any small thing. This is the temple, right? In Jerusalem, of all places. And he knows that there's going to be consequences. You don't go into the temple in Jerusalem, clash with the establishment, the powers that be, and believe that there's not going to be a clapback, right, of some sort from those in power. Mm-hmm. So when we begin to actually take seriously the way of Jesus for our own way of life in the public square, it's going to shape how we engage in our society and respond to these issues. That we are also going to be in solidarity with those who are poor and most vulnerable in our communities, and that we are willing to that our responsibility is not to control the social order, right, from the top down. But from the grassroots, bear witness to something else and have a prophetic witness to call our society to what God desires for all of us, right? Not in a hegemonic or dominating way, but in an invitational way that God has something better for all of us. And we're willing to clash and confront, right? And we're willing to engage in the kind of methods Jesus talks about, the things that make for peace. This is at Luke 19, as he weeps over Jerusalem. He says, if only they had known the things that make for peace, because it kind of then anticipates just the violence that will come in, 66 to 70 AD with the Roman Jewish War, right? So that's like kind of the backdrop of so much of the Gospels, is this anticipation that there's this zealot revolution that's going to take place, and Rome is going to come in and destroy and slaughter folks. 6,000 Jews will be killed, many more millions. It's just horrifying, the violence that's exerted. And so Jesus laments that, right? If only they had known the things that make for true shalom, true well-being and flourishing. And that suggests that there are certain kinds of practices that are more conducive for this work than other ones are, right? And I do believe that nonviolence, it's a strategy, it's a social change strategy that is actually conducive with the peacemaking of Jesus that we see. Him teaching us, love your enemies, and the kind of subversiveness that so many of us miss about the Sermon on the Mount, right? The go the extra mile when, they're only allowed to go 1 mile, right? The soldiers. And so if you could think, it's almost like a comedy in your head, like that Jesus is telling, like, they're only allowed to go 1 mile, and then you just keep going, and all of a sudden the power and agency has shifted, right?
Give me my stuff back. I got you. Where you need to go. I'm gonna take you the whole way.
Now the Roman soldier's like, no, come back here, give me that back, because he doesn't want to get in trouble. So there's an agency switch. So it's a creative, nonviolent response to this injustice that's happening. Same thing even with the turning the cheek, right? It's not about you getting smacked around. That's not Jesus' point. It's that people don't have agency. So if you're seen as nothing and you're slapped across backhandedly, that's like a way you slap someone as an inferior. And so when he says turn the other cheek, you're slapping the other way, which actually as an equal, right? And so, like, the point isn't that Jesus wants you to get smacked around. It's that you are in moments where it seems like someone might have no agency, all of a sudden they do have agency and can break cycles of violence in creative ways, strategic ways, right? And so we take those kind of small things along with the huge radical action of Jesus literally taking up his own cross and clashing with the establishment. And it's a pretty clear picture then for us as the church that we've got to actually take Jesus seriously in our public action, in our political imagination, not in terms of partisanship, but in terms of God's reign on earth and our willingness to embrace suffering on behalf of our neighbors because we love them and are committed to their justice.
Yeah, I can remember the first time that I heard that part about turn the other cheek and whatnot. So we got a new pastor years ago, maybe 5 years. Barrett, I know you're going to listen to this, and I'm sorry if I got the years wrong. What's funny is I was on his search committee, so I should really know the year. But a lot has happened since then. But I remember he did a sermon on that, and I never heard any of that, where he said the same thing, like, no, you were only allowed to go 1 mile, and then after that, like, going further was a way to take to both be a servant, but also be submissive. And the same thing with turn the other cheek. And I feel like, and I might be wrong, like when they ask for your coat and you give them more clothes too. The way that it is, like, you're basically stripping down like naked, like, oh, you need clothes, I'll give it all to you. If I need to be naked for you, I've got you. And I might be remembering that wrong, but I remember sitting there going, I never in my life has this ever been preached to me.
And it puts a shame on the person that would actually end up taking everything from them, right? And so, that's actually a method that people have used globally. Really? Women stripping down naked as a way of actually putting shame on those who are oppressing them. Like, these are actually things that actually do happen around the world, right? And so, I think we sometimes misunderstand really the subversiveness of Jesus in some of those comments.
Yeah, and I think that's intentional because of the way that the church has used Jesus as a way to colonialize.
Right, we domesticate, dilute his teachings, right?
I do want to talk about that word domesticated, but you used the word zealous a minute ago, or zealot mentality or something like that. I have heard, and again, because I haven't read your most current book that comes out probably by the time this is out, I'll put it out around September. Why not? Because I think your book comes out September 1st. I've heard you, or I've read you, because I try to do a little bit of research on that. You talk a bit about Barnabas, like a Barnabas mentality, the role of Barnabas in the Gospels. Can you
Or
talk a
Barabbas,
bit?
Barabbas.
Oh yeah, Barabbas.
Yeah,
Sorry.
yeah,
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 I'm thinking of the wrong B. Yeah, yeah,
yeah,
Barabbas. Which made
yeah,
me think, and I referenced my friend Josh earlier. All the time when we're arguing with some friends of ours, many of them are more moderate than us, or many are just the opposite, or where I was maybe 15 years ago.
yeah,
He'll just yell, give us Barabbas, and he'll just leave the conversation. And so
yeah,
when
yeah,
I heard you say that or read you say that, I'm like, Josh, this is your man right here.
yeah,
But being that I haven't read it, can you break that apart a bit about me? Because all I've seen is little 2 or 3 like sentence segments. But
yeah.
I'm genuinely curious, and I have already bought your book, so I'm going to
Yeah.
read it. So I'm not
Yeah. I
stealing
have
it.
a whole chapter called Liberating Barabbas, right? I went all in and I have a whole huge chapter on that. And there's just the sum of it, right? I mean, I get into more detail, but the gist of it is we've domesticated and diluted Barabbas's significance in scripture. And in some ways, we do it which allows us to further dilute and domesticate Jesus. Like that's my
Hmm.
argument, right?
Hmm.
And so we ignore what the text actually says about Barabbas, and then we use him in other ways. Sometimes he's just characterized as, you know, just a wild, crazy madman who's foaming at the mouth, who's a serial killer. You know,
Yeah,
he's almost like the
yeah.
Joker or something, just killing people for no reason, going through the villages, right? And he's just this horrible person, right? Or all these different kind of characters
Hmm.
of him.
Hmm.
There's actually, when I actually Googled and I found like there's a little clip, like some where like literally he's like cockeyed and drooling and this crazy laugh that's happening. It's just interesting, like how he's been characterized at times. So there's this perception of him. And then maybe a more fancy way of diluting him is people have used him to kind of push and focus on penal substitutionary atonement.
Hmm.
Even though that's not what the text is doing, that's what people want to do and use him for. And so the argument is, you know, Jesus is the innocent one, and so there he's our guilty one, and Jesus takes his place and all that kind of stuff. And so we
Yeah,
are all, I am Barabbas, right? That kind of thing, you know.
yeah.
Now it is interesting that the Gospel of Luke is the only one where the language of innocence does show up, but it's not talking about innocence in terms of like a sinful life or innocent life. It's talking about the political charges, right? Jesus is being charged with subverting the empire and telling
Hmm.
people not to pay the taxes and all this stuff, right? It's subversion. And the argument is Jesus is innocent of these charges, right? Which are actually questionable because in some way he doesn't do them, and in some ways he kind of has done it. So it's kind of
Yeah,
complicated, right? But anyway, so it's
yeah.
political charges, and we ignore that, and we just make it about the innocence of Jesus and the guiltiness of Barabbas, so that we can talk about substitutionary atonement. But what we actually find, number one, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, all 4 of them actually mention Barabbas, which is interesting. Like there's a lot of things that not all 4 gospels don't talk about, right? There's lots of, I mean, we only have one true like Christmas birth story. Maybe you could argue 2.5, right? If you
Yeah,
include Matthew.
yeah.
But we don't really, but yet all of them seem to, it's so important for us to have Barabbas at the end of the story. Why is Barabbas so important at the end of the story, right? And what we find is that they're consistent about who Barabbas was. He was an insurrectionist. He participated in the uprising, right? He was a revolutionary, or we would sometimes people use the language of zealots. At that time, it's complicated. Even though the gospel writers use the language of zealots, it actually wasn't a thing quite yet in Jesus's time. It actually it emerges a couple of decades later when the gospel writers are writing that language is used. But the idea of zealots actually were there. Like there were groups like that, even if they hadn't coalesced under that name yet. There were these folks who wanted to engage in violent revolutionary work. They believed that God's deliverance was calling him, inviting them into that work.
Hmm.
And so Barabbas represents that tradition, right? From the Maccabees up till the Jewish-Roman War, there's this tradition that exists of seeing that we need to violently overthrow and bring God's
Yeah,
kingdom back in. So it's clear, all of them say that he participated in the insurrection. Matthew's a little bit different though. Matthew actually has probably a more extended conversation around Jesus and Barabbas. All of a sudden now, you have, in fact, it's actually really actually matters what biblical text you use. In this one, there's some cases where it doesn't matter, but your
In the
translations,
translation, okay.
yeah, what manuscripts, right, the
Mhm.
people are drawing from. Because in Matthew, some of the oldest manuscripts actually say, like, who is it? Jesus Christ or Jesus Barabbas, right?
Mm.
And then in some of the later manuscripts, it seems like they took out the Jesus Barabbas part and just put Barabbas because maybe they were uncomfortable with that. But it seems actually that it was intentional,
Like it's a
that they
title.
were, right, that there's, well, it's like two Jesuses, right? And you think
Mhm.
about the name Jesus, like Joshua, Yeshua, the one who saves, the one who delivers, right? Like that's, and so you have Jesus the Christ or Jesus Barabbas. Who's going to be your savior? Who's going to be your deliverer? Who are you counting on and looking to for deliverance? Right. That's what Matthew really brings you to, that question, because they choose Barabbas, right, instead of
Mm.
Jesus. And so, what kind of revolutionary do you want? You have this nonviolent revolutionary who's willing to be crucified. That doesn't sound so appeasing, probably, for folks who are struggling in that moment.
Yeah,
And
who
then you
wants
have
that?
this guy with a proven track record, right? He's willing to put his life on the line. He's willing to fight for the people. What kind of revolutionary do you want, right? And so I think that we have there this contrast, and it has socio-political implications for both Barabbas and Jesus, right? In terms of the way in which they go about seeking liberation on earth, God's reign on earth, shalom and peace, right? How do we actually go about that? And that ties back to the whole idea of the things that make for peace, right?
Mm.
What are the things that actually make for peace? What is the actual way of Jesus, right? It's not just about going off to heaven, but how does Jesus want us to live in this world politically, right?
Yeah.
Not partisanship in terms of, but the politics of the kingdom of God. Like, how do we engage and practice that here on earth as a counter witness to empire and oppression and domination and cycles of violence, right? How do we embody that here and now? And so I think Barabbas actually invites us to see a radical Jesus, a
Mm.
nonviolent revolutionary Messiah, right? But that's not willing to engage in destroying his enemies to get there.
Yeah.
That he's got a different path of actually truly bringing shalom. And there's a possibility that anybody can participate and be invited into that new vision and new dream.
Mm. Is the word, and this is not really related, but I'm curious. So I know when I spoke with Tom Wright, he used Paul and zeal, and then he related it back to the Old Testament. I can't remember who he's related it back to, but is the term like Paul being zealous, is that
Zealous.
related to zealot? Or are those two words being used
Yeah.
in different things? Because when I hear zealous in that way, or zealot, like I will kill you if you don't agree with me. Like you're the wrong type of Christian or the wrong kind of Jew. You got to go. Is that the same way that they're using zealous
It's
for Barabbas?
related. Yeah, it's definitely related. Zealous for God, right? And what you got to remember, like, for they're not just, I mean, on one hand, like, it's helpful in some ways to say like they're freedom fighters, right?
Mhm.
Like, to use that language. But
It's
if
helpful when
we
you
are
want to
not
be one.
right, but
Yeah.
but if we're not careful, we'll lose the sight that they are trying to be faithful to God, that they're doing this out of their understanding of who they believe God is and what they believe God desires for them to do. So it is out of their faith that they are operating, and they are zealous for God in this, right? Now, we might question, like, is this a meaningful interpretation, like
Mhm.
in terms of how they're interpreting what they believe God is calling them to? But it is their religious faith and devotion to God, their zealousness for God, that is driving them to this kind of action. And so it's not
Mm.
just a socio-political response. It is actually a stepping out in faith that this is the kind of action that they believe God desires for them.
Yeah. So I want to stay on that theme, and then I'll make this one of my last two questions because I know I promised you an hour, and I'm about to go over, and I'm sorry. So
Yeah, it's no problem.
you have time?
Yeah.
Perfect. Yeah. Yeah, I've got the whole day, but I'm sure you don't. So in thinking of that, so when I hear you say that, so I think that both sides of the aisle, both, especially here in America, both, well, all of the aisles, the Green Party, the Democrats, the Republicans, conservatives, the evangelicals, the whatever, an evangelical, if that even means anything anymore, but that's a whole different hour-long conversation. I think they do think that what they're doing, if they're oppressing people, they're doing it because of the way that they interpret God. And if
Yeah.
they're trying to fight for liberation, that they're doing it because of the interpretation of Christ. And they both are coming from a perspective of I'm doing the best that I can, which I hear you saying the same thing for people that are trying to interpret their faith. They end up being violent with it, because that's how they see their zeal, their passion for God driving them. And so I'm going to give a hypothetical. So hypothetically, January, whatever the induction day is, doesn't matter who the president is. If we have a new president and that president wants to enact massive amounts of change, you're going to have the church try to come alongside them, play politics, play power, and exert their influence to try to exact racial reconciliation, all kinds of change. And they're going to do it with their interpretation of, I'm doing this to be righteousness with God. And let's say that happens the opposite way. The current president is still the president, and the church continues to come alongside them, many of which have already vocally expressed their opinion on Black Lives Matter, racial reconciliation, segregation, a lot of things. And you can just Google a lot of big name church leaders and you'll see that. And not just on race, but on gender and sexuality and all kinds of things.
Yeah.
How does a pastor, a minister, a professor, or just a dude that happens to work at a bank, how do I discern well that? And then how do I take that discernment and go, here's how I can speak against that in a way that helpfully exacts change? Or here's how I can instead push back against that, showing compassion to those that are where I was 20 years ago. And I say that because I think you could go both ways. I think people pivot on that pendulum, both sides, constantly based on their emotions. I hope I'm asking that question well. I'm trying my best. So
I think so. And you can let me know if I missed it
Perfect.
or not. But yeah, I mean, I think that so diverse interpretations of what it means to be Christian are inevitable, right?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, with diverse people, in diverse spaces and contexts, with diverse experiences, there's going to be diverse interpretations. That's inevitable.
Mm-hmm.
And so there's going to always have to be ongoing conversations about what it means to be Christian. And we're going to have to be dialoguing across difference, right? Like that's a necessary part of what it means to be the church, is that the church can't just be in a silo. It has to wrestle with the historic church, but also the global church, right?
Yeah.
And we have to be conversing and dialoguing and reinterpreting in new moments with new understanding. It's just an ongoing conversation that has to happen. I guess the question number one is, what is the criteria that we use to base our conversations, to orient and norm our conversations, right? I would argue, and that this is also an interpretation, right? I would argue that it's the life and teachings of Jesus is the norming norm for Christians. I know it's radical to say that. It is actually radical, though, to say that, right? In some churches, to say that the life of Jesus ought to norm our lives in some way or form, right? And so for others, that's not the case. It's, maybe an interpretation of John 3:16, right? Or Galatians and Romans interpretations, right? Of, justification by faith, and from a Protestant Reformation 16th century interpretation of that text, right? Like there's different ways. And so it's not settled. I think that we will have to grapple with and dialogue vulnerably and openly around what we see happening throughout all of Scripture and how it climaxes in the person of Jesus Christ, and how that shapes our action in the world. At the point that we're at now, like I would argue from reading Christian history that slowly beginning with Constantine and going forth from that, Jesus continues to get further and further marginalized and in terms of shaping our ethics, right? And so I would make a historical argument. I would make a textual argument about what Jesus seems to be inviting us to do himself, right? How does Jesus describe the kind of life that we're supposed to live as the starting point, as a launching, and the lens through which we read everything else? But I do think that is going to be the starting point, that it has to be, is that we're dialoguing about these things that actually really do matter because they shape how we live and act in the world. And we have to be dialoguing across difference, and then we respond. And I think that in terms of, the different partisan responses, we've got to come to a point in the church where we realize, we can't let the tail wag the dog. For so long, we've allowed the platforms of political parties that are really coming from elites to determine our Christian ethics. and our practice, right? Our political imagination. Literally. I mean, you step into a church and then usually within seconds, oh, this is a Democratic leading church or Republican leading church, right? And so it's completely shaped our imagination. And it's not necessarily to say, I don't want to equivocate as though they're equally the bad, equally the same. I actually don't believe that. But I also believe that neither of them reflect the kingdom of God.
Mm-hmm.
And we've got to have enough integrity and rootedness in God's reign that we can speak truthfully to everybody, right? Even in my new book, like one of the things I lament is I said, in fact, I was just thinking yesterday, I was watching the John Lewis funeral.
Yeah.
So number one, we have short-term memory. So all of a sudden now George Bush is so great and things like that. He was a war criminal that thousands, if not millions of people died because of him. Right. So just because he can be polite and civil, I think there's, and even Obama, like in my book, I say, like, I was disappointed the ways that we were not able to prophetically hold him accountable. Yes, he's the first Black president. Yes, he's pushing for things like healthcare in ways, and he was getting enormous resistance, and it made it hard for him to do his work. Yes, all these things. And he also worked with big banks and did drone warfare and all that kind of stuff in ways that were problematic, right? Yeah. And we have to have the integrity to not align ourselves with anybody in that kind of way where we're just towing a party line, but bear witness faithfully. And so, like, I probably would disagree with the ways that many Republicans critiqued Obama. I think that they were actually more immoral, some of them, right? But the fact that doesn't take away the responsibility for me to have a faithful prophetic witness in the public square and to name truthfully and unveil evil that's happening in society, no matter who's in that seat, right? Yeah. And I think that's important.
Yeah. Talking about John Lewis. So did you read the New York Times piece that came out, I think, yesterday?
Yeah, really briefly. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a part in there. Hold on one second. Hey, baby.
Levi broke the TV, so now we can't watch Thunderman.
Tell you what, I'll come fix it in just a few minutes. I'm almost done, okay?
I've got little ones, so I know how that works.
Shut the door, baby. Don't slam it. All the way. Almost. So what she said, I don't know if you could hear or not, is my son broke the TV and now they can't watch the Thundermen, which is some, I think, Disney Channel. Yeah. What's even more funny is I don't know how to edit video, so this will stay in the video for the people on Patreon.
Hey. So, a little bonus footage.
Yeah. So I'll leave this part in here. If you would like to meet my youngest daughter, become a patron supporter of the show, because she just showed up on camera, all messy hair and everything. Don't tell her mom. But in the New York Times piece, here's a part that my pastor posted it, and then I read it, and I agree. So he said it gave him chills. So here's what it says. John Lewis wrote in the days before his death that when historians pick up their pens to write the story of the 21st century, let them say that it was your generation who laid down the heavy burdens of hate at last, and that peace finally triumphed over violence, aggression, and war. So I say to you, walk with the wind, brother and sisters, and let the spirit of peace and power and everlasting love be your guide. Like, it's just so powerful. But yeah, I watched some of that stuff. I watched President Obama's eulogy. I think a speech or eulogy. I don't know what you want to call it.
Yeah, eulogy, yeah.
But yeah. Last question, I think. No, it's not the last question. There's a question I've asked everybody that has come on this year. So I have to ask that question because we're 2/3 of the way through the year and I can't miss one now. But here's why I ask. And it's because I've heard you talk about it, I think, on the Inverse podcast or maybe some other podcast, because you're on there with Jared McKenna, who does a lot of good things. And for those listening, you should go listen to that right now. He's doing a lot of fantastic things on the other side of the planet. But so for people like myself, I feel like oftentimes when people come in and they're like, oh, now I'm woke. Now I have something to say. And not just about race, but about LGBT inclusion or this, that, or the other. We come in and we just suck up all the air and say, now here's what we need to do. Because I've, in my arrogance of 15 minutes of learning since I've now come to the light, I need to do X, Y, or Z. So what would you... I need to do X, Y, or Z. So what would you say to people that are starting into this conversation and then now want to do something? How do they do that without actually sucking up all of the space for other people that have already been doing something? Like, what is a wise way to begin to enter into that stream?
Yeah, I mean, I always tell, when I go and speak to congregations, I always say, first and foremost, like, first you need to figure out, like, map out, like, who's been doing this work already. Just lay that out, do your research and who's been doing the work, 'cause that's one
Hmm.
thing. And you want to enter in as followers, not leaders, right?
Hmm.
And you need to have the epistemological humility, right? That is humility in our ways of knowing. Um, as you enter in, realizing that you don't have the lived experience and the traditions that have been at this for a very long time. And so your perceptions and analysis of what should be done or shouldn't be done is coming from a very limited context, right? It's not that you can grow in that. So it's not necessarily that you have to be permanently babies in that space for the rest of your life.
Hmm.
But it's not until you've kind of been reformed and have new lenses to interpret the world that you can actually maybe contribute it more meaningfully. And until then, you need to see yourself as followers, as not, I think white people, especially in this case, and anybody in a dominant position, right? It would, depending on what the issue is, have the tendency to see themselves as perpetual teachers, right?
Mm.
But what does it mean to invert those postures where the first are last and last are first, and to enter in as students and allow those who are most impacted, those most vulnerable who are most impacted, to actually lead and guide the way forward. I think that is really important work. Um, Maybe I'll leave it there. Let me just also, and there's just so much unlearning to be done, and that's why, like, action and so there's a temptation, like different churches I've seen, like there's some churches where all they want to do is read books, right? And they will read books, book after book. They do book study after book study after book study, and they
Hmm.
see that as the work, right? It's just book studies. And it's this kind of like college educated, kind of comfortable way of engaging problems. And if we read a book about it, then we've overcome.
Mm.
And then there's other churches where, oh, we don't have time for that. We need to act, right? And so you just start doing things, right? And you got their to-do list. And both of those are problematic, right? And so we've got to find a way where real meaningful practice happens, where our action and our learning are coming together
Mm.
simultaneously.
Mm.
Um, if it's just intellectual stimulation, right? I mean, it's empty if it doesn't also include action that we're learning and pulling into. And if it's just action, we're likely, without the learning and unlearning and relearning, we're likely to do more harm than we even realize in the
Mm.
process, that while we're trying to do good. And so I think
Yeah.
all of those things have to happen simultaneously. And that would also deeply impact the way that we enter into spaces and contribute in those spaces if we're doing our homework and acting, but acting through following, right? And
Yeah.
solidarity, linking arms with those who have been most affected.
Yeah. I like acting through following. I like that. Yeah. Come alongside and don't get in the front of the line. Just fall in line, learn something, and then do something. So being that you just met my 5-year-old, I'm going to phrase this question in a different way. The question I've been asking everyone this year is just a bigger, broader concept of God. And so say I put her in my lap, I put her on the mic, and I say, "Hey, ask Drew whatever you want to ask him." And she says, "Drew, what is God? Who is God?
Hmm.
What is that? Like, what is that?" And you're trying to explain it. What are the words that you would try to wrap around that?
I probably would um, point us, I would say that, God is so much bigger than anything that we can describe. And so the best thing that we can do is look to where God has revealed God's self most clearly, right? And so for me, that would be Jesus, and particularly Christ crucified, right? I think about 1 Corinthians 1, where Paul says that um, that the in the crucified Christ, God's power and God's wisdom is revealed, right? It's really fascinating that God's power and God's wisdom is revealed in the crucified Christ. And then it goes on to suggest then that helps us interpret how God is acting in the world. God has chosen the weak to shame the strong. God has chosen those who are considered nothing to shame those who are considered something, right? And so forth. And so,
Mhm.
um, yeah, that maybe having handles on God is not something that we can really do, right? That's something beyond us. Um, But what we can do is, what's it in Hebrew somewhere in the beginning? It's like, but we do see Jesus, right? There in Hebrews, and I think that that's it. We see Jesus, and we get a glimpse into the character of God, and we get a glimpse into the kind of ways that God works, right? So when people talk about this mean, angry God that's death dealing and just wants to punish people,
It's a
and I'm
lot.
like, but we see Jesus, and
Yeah.
it seems like he's for life. He's life-giving, and he's healing and restoring and empowering, and so we get a very different vision of who God is and how God works. And then from that, that's how I understand how the Spirit is at work in the world. That God's Spirit is also then healing and restoring and loving and encouraging people to stand up and speak for truth, right? Because it's congruent with the very life and character of Jesus Christ. And so, for me, that's how I would answer that question.
Yeah, no, I like that. Put people in the right spot. They hear this, they want to do something, they want to learn more about you, they want to buy all of your books available where all the good books are sold. Like, where would you direct people to? Where are you active? Et cetera, et cetera.
Yeah, so first, you can find both of my books are available. One for pre-order. So Trouble I've Seen is available anywhere books are sold. Who Will Be a Witness? Igniting Activism for God's Justice, Love, and Deliverance. That is available for pre-order, and it's going to be releasing soon. And so if you want to make sure that you get the first batch coming out, would pre-order now. And then, yeah, you can find me. I have a website, Hart, HART.com. And so they can find my website there. There's a contact information. That's where, I get most of my speaking requests and stuff usually come through there.
It's not the way I did it. It's the way
Yeah, not everyone, but that's a lot of it comes through there. And then you can find me on the Inverse podcast. Again, Jared McKenna and I, from literally opposite sides of the globe, just having really fascinating conversations with a wide variety of people from all over the world around scripture and their stories and liberative readings of scripture. And it's just a lot of fun. And so we think it's unique and just adds an extra layer of good conversation in the podcast world. And so definitely encourage people to do that. You can find me on Twitter and Instagram at DRUHART, Drew Hart. And also I have a Facebook page that you can find me at as well.
Yeah.
It's the one with the GI versus my regular profile. I think it's just Drew Hart, but Drew GI Hart is my Facebook profile page.
To make those simple, people listen, just hit pause, go down to the show notes, click whichever one you want to click on, and then hit the button, the like, the follow, the whatever the button you want to click is. Question about with Jared. So I don't even know what the time zone is because I think he's in New Zealand. Like, when do you actually talk to people? Because I know I've had to get up at like 5 a.m. to talk to people at lunchtime in London, and like 3 a.m. to talk to people in South Africa. Like, how does that even logistically
work?
Like just.
Yeah, so he's in Australia.
Same time zone, though, right?
He's exactly 12 hours apart. We're
so
exactly
one of you
12
is talking
hours.
At midnight or 2.
So usually, no. So what it is we usually, oftentimes it's around like 9 p.m. for me on a Thursday, and it'll be like Friday morning at 9 a.m. for him, right? And sometimes we flip it. So then it's me in the morning, but it's usually been me in the evening and him in the morning just because of our schedules. But we have had some tricky times, especially because of global guests, right? So we've had to adjust to do some stuff. So he's been up at like 3 a.m. I think he's had it a little bit worse than I have overall, just because of making it work for our guests.
Nobody's keeping score.
But yeah, nobody's keeping score. Don't tell Jared that I'm getting the better hand of this often. But yeah, so it's been fun. It's been a lot of fun, but it is also challenging in terms of scheduling. Yeah.
I get it. Yeah, I have some of those similar challenges here where I'm like, all right, so I work these hours and then the kids are here and then the pandemic adds extra hours so I can either record after 9:15 on any day of the week or not at all. When I used to have a lot more flexibility. But yeah, I was just curious. We said like, I don't, just logistically, how the heck does that work? But well, thanks again, Drew. I really enjoyed the conversation. I'd like to talk to you again sometime about whatever we want to talk about, if you're willing. But yeah, thanks so much for coming on the show. I've really enjoyed the conversation, and I genuinely look forward to your book. I'm just going to go right to the chapter on Barabbas, just because. Yeah, that's what, and then I'll go back. It's
probably my favorite chapter. So
really,
yeah.
Well, good. Well, thanks again for coming on. Appreciate it.
Yep. All right. Take care.
Yeah. All right. So I'm going to end this video recording right